In this screencast, I'm going to go through some of the ecology with you. I was very select about which slides I'm showing you to kind of focus on just those objectives I gave you for the midterm. So let's get started. First of all, we should have some concept really of what ecology is, and we can look at ecology at various levels, right? We can look at the interactions between living organisms and their environment at the level of the organism itself, an individual, but more likely ecologists look at it at these other levels. So you can do population ecology, where you're looking at just a group of interbreeding members in that of the same species in that area. You can go to community. You can go up to a much bigger level of ecology, looking at an ecosystem, which at that point includes both the biotic and the abiotic components, and we'll talk about that in a minute. You can go into landscape and global ecology. So mostly what we focused on was probably these middle three, a little bit on population, a little bit on community, and then just in general on ecosystems. So we look at this by virtue of this idea of biogeography. So we can look at where organisms, where populations, where communities live in terms of where they're distributed in the physical environment. So biogeography is doing that. When we look at biogeography, we can see certain patterns, particularly when we're looking at these things that we call abiotic factors. So things like temperature and rainfall are going to very much dictate where certain things can live. And that's going to change. So temperature and rainfall is going to influence what grows there. So the primary producers of the plants, and then in turn is also going to influence which types of animals live there. So we look at sort of the energy flow of that area based on those factors. Here's a number of abiotic factors, probably the principal ones. Energy, so where is the energy? What is the energy source? It can be, probably the primary one is sunlight, but energy can also be provided by the ocean and the way the ocean is bringing materials up from the bottom through the action of waves. Temperature, water being a really principal one. What would be the type of water and what happens there over the seasons, if there is a seasonal change. The nutrients themselves. So some of the things we looked at in chapter 1 and 2 are looking at the basic chemistry of the area, what kinds of things are there, what types of molecules, what types of compounds exist. And then other factors like the oxygen availability, how salty or salinity is referring to the saltiness of water. We could look at the terrestrial areas in terms of fire and wind, and anything that's sort of the extraordinary situations where we have movement of the plates or we have volcanic activity, etc. So all those things are contributing abiotic factors, which will influence what can and will survive in an area. Here's just a quick picture just to remind you of some things we talked about. So this is the idea of water and water's ability to kind of act as an energy source as it's turning over when the temperature changes in the spring and fall. So this would be in a lake environment. So that is a piece of understanding of how nutrients can get recycled in these particular areas. We can look at distribution related to temperature and what organisms do when the temperature changes. Right? So do they migrate? Do they kind of go into a state of torpor, which is this estivation? They also can do that in hibernation, where it's a much more extended state where they're sort of slow down their body processes. So these are just some strategies that organisms can have. So all of these things are going to influence whether or not plants grow. So with the water, temperature, nutrient availability, all of that is going to come down to what what amount of plant growth can occur, and we look at that as the primary productivity of an area. So without plants, there's nothing else that's really going to survive very well in most cases. So we look at what the plants actually can produce, which is the primary productivity, and then what's actually available to organisms to use as food, which is that net primary productivity. We can also, if I can move my picture here so you can see a little better, we can look at what's above the ground, the total biomass that's available. So to organisms that live above the ground, that's kind of an important piece. So this is just the basic idea of abiotic factors influencing biotic. Abiotic meaning the things that we're seeing, the sunlight, the carbon dioxide, the water, the oxygen, and how that influences the growth. So you see of the plant and the plant's ability to produce energy for other organisms. All of those things will influence, in particular, where things are located. So most of what we see on this little world map is where things live, either based on those factors, particularly temperature and precipitation is being shown here. And then, therefore, what types of biomes, remember the term biome is these large areas that sort of define an area, like tropical forest or tundra or desert, is going to be largely determined by temperature and precipitation. All right, so that was that first introduction on chapter 41, I think, and now we're into chapter 45, where we're looking at the populations, population size and density. So these are just a couple of concepts that you need to have sort of down. So what is a population, first of all? What is and what's going to influence its size, which is represented here by N, the capital letter N, and then how many of them are in a certain area would be population density. So I think those are pretty intuitive. There's different ways to measure that, and as scientists, we did this one. We did the quadrat method, where we went out and measured approximate density within a population on your lawn of grass versus weeds. So that's our quadrat measurement. It's very helpful and handy in a situation where things aren't going to run away. But a lot of cases that's not true. So other methods are such as the mark and recapture method, where there's some type of capturing and then that tagging and then letting them go, and then creating an estimation based on the recapture of what the population size might be. We can also look at how species are distributed. We can look at this idea of dispersion. So some species will uniformly disperse, some will somewhat randomly disperse, and some will operate more in this clumped dispersal pattern. So you can take a look at those just to remind you of some of the things we talked about. This was the one, remember, we said it's kind of hard to tell when you look at this picture that it looks much more clumped than uniform, but if you saw an aerial view of a penguin colony, you'd see a much more uniform distribution existing. We can also look at the individuals in a population based on what's their lifespan. So what's the survivorship more likely to be? So these are survivorship curves, and we can look at this type 1 as a survivorship curve where humans, for the example, they live a fairly long, once they're born, they live a pretty long, they have a long life expectancy, so that they maintain they're pretty resilient against population loss or death in the early stages of development. Here we have this type 2 survivorship curve of birds, and you can see there that birds kind of you can have a large number of birds that are born. They can fairly rapidly die off. However, they can still, those which survive live for quite a while, so they can have that longer life expectancy. as well. Trees, in this case, would be a type 3 survivorship curve, where many of the initial population doesn't survive, but those which do can live very long life expectancies. So that's just a way of kind of looking at it. Is when does death occur? Does it occur in the early years, kind of evenly, and so there's more of a middle of the road thing where you see sort of it's equally probable to live or die at these early stages, or this type of a curve which we see because death occurs mostly when we age in the older age ranges. So those are survivorship. The other curves we looked at are these, and that's population growth. So if we take a population and we take it from the very earliest stage where we have a very small population size, and we see that it grows like this exponential growth curve, or a J-shaped curve, that means that there's unlimited resources, there's plenty of space, there are all the things that populations need to grow, so there's very little limitation on this population growing. Most, however, even though they can start more like a J-shaped curve, really go into this thing called logistic growth, where eventually as population increases in size over time, some of those resources become more limited. So we see this S-shape growth curve. And that, so when we calculate, which I will not asking you to do on the exam, but as we go up on this curve, we see changes in the rate of growth. And we did a little bit with this earlier, but we aren't going to worry about that. But you can kind of see that there's a slowing down that occurs. So the population is still growing, but the rate of growth is slowing down as you hit this line right here called K, which is our carrying capacity. So this is the line that we can kind of think about as more the maximum number of the population that could live and thrive in an area is right around this carrying capacity line. If you go above carrying capacity, you have a population that's going to be stressed and usually declines. If you're below this K, or this carrying capacity, then there's still room for expansion of that population. So the resources are still not limiting the population size. Here's just a different way to look at it. In real life, most populations are going to look like this, so they aren't going to even be this top one where it's just kind of flattening out. Notice that this one is showing yeast, and a yeast growing in a test tube. You have this initially, you just have a really rapid growth that then they quickly run out of space, and so they have this kind of a growth curve that looks almost artificial, and it is in this case. So really rapid growth, everything it needs, yeast keep doubling and doubling and doubling until eventually something has to give and they reach that limit that is enforced on them. Down here, though, is more reasonable. So we see usually populations start to grow, the rate of growth starts to change a little bit, they reach around what the carrying capacity is in that particular environment, and then it's going to fluctuate up and down. There's a growth rate calculation, just basically the simplest version where we just look at a change in the population number over time is related to the birth versus minus the death rate. Things which affect population, which regulate or control population size, can be either density dependent or density independent. If they're density dependent, it basically means as the population keeps growing, you're going to find more things which are going to limit it, such as competition within that population. You're going to get a lot of waste products, more possibility of disease, where density independent factors are all the things which are outside of the control or doesn't matter about population size. It's things such as weather, pollution, etc.